Andrew's right, a lot has changed since 1967. We've been talking about 1967 quite a lot, but nobody's mentioned that in 1967, England were the reigning world football champions. And the then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, used to say, "Have you noticed that we only win the World Cup under Labour?" He meant it as a joke. I don't think he would have expected that it would still be true 50 years later. Politics have changed as well. Back then we had men and women of real stature at the head of government. Dennis Healey was a polymath with a double first from Oxford. Harold Macmillan was a decorated war hero. Enoch Powell, for all the controversy, was a distinguished classical scholar who spoke 5 languages. And nowadays we have Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, and somebody else I'll mention in a moment, Vladimir Putin. I'll come to him in a moment. I think trust in politics probably is at an all-time low. Our first reaction when we hear politicians say something is to disbelieve them. The truth seems to be malleable. Whether it's the Kremlin swearing blind that there are no Russian troops in Ukraine, even when we've seen the evidence on our TV screens, or Michael Gove telling us not to trust experts, or Donald Trump telling voters that Barack Obama is a Muslim who wasn't born in the United States. And I won't even venture into the minefield of claims that were made by both sides on the Brexit debate. In this post-truth era of fake news and deliberate deception and plain lies, there's an even greater onus on people of goodwill, academics and writers and members of the intelligentsia, and people like yourselves to stand up for ethical integrity. It's not a party political issue, it's a simple question of honesty and maintaining the sanity of public life. And the role of management education is a central one in shaping the future leaders of the world and the tenor of public discourse. So don't leave it to the politicians. Having said that, the relationship between truth and invention, between fact and fiction, can also be quite entertaining. And I'm going to take fact and fiction as the theme for tonight because it's been pretty central to everything I've done in my career. Beginning way back when I was studying Russian as a schoolboy at the Manchester Grammar School. And we had a very adventurous young Russian tutor, a Russian master as we called him, who took us on trips to Moscow, back then when the Soviet Union really was the evil empire, in Ronald Reagan's words. It was the Brezhnev era, and it was an era of great economic hardship. Luxury goods like fridges or televisions were in very short supply, and even getting on the waiting list for a fridge was quite an achievement. But the shortages were grist to the mill of that Soviet humor, those wry, bitter jokes about the collapsing Soviet economy and the hardships that made everybody suffer, but the jokes kept people sane. And there was one Soviet joke about the man who does finally get on the waiting list for a fridge. And when he asks the salesman when he can collect it, the salesman says, "September the 24th, 2 years from now." And the man looks in his diary and he says, "That day's no good." And the salesman says, "Why?" And the man says, "Because that's the day the plumber's coming to fix my heating." It's an old joke. Ronald Reagan told it. There's another even older one about the 2 Russians who are in a food queue, and they've been standing there for so long that one of them pulls out a gun and says, "I'm going to shoot that Brezhnev because he's the cause of all this." And hours later he comes back and his friend's still in the queue and he says, "Well, did you shoot the president?" He said, "No, the queue was too long." I'll just tell one more because you're laughing at them. It took Russia a long time to put those warnings on cigarette packets that we're all used to, the thing about, smoke this cigarette and you'll be dead the day after tomorrow. But they did put them on in the late 1980s when I was there as the Moscow correspondent for the BBC. And there were stories coming in from villages all over the country where mobs of angry smokers were besieging the state tobacco stores and shouting, "We don't want these new cigarettes that give you cancer, we want the old ones that were safe." Anyway, those school trips obviously did the trick, because Russia became a very important part of my life. I went on to study it as an undergraduate in Oxford and St. Petersburg, and then as a graduate at Harvard in the United States. So when I joined the BBC, the fact that I spoke Russian is what prompted them to send me, first of all, to Poland during the Solidarity years of the 1980s, and then to Moscow during the Perestroika era and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I love my time at the BBC. I have to say, if you've been in the BBC, you do maintain a lifelong fondness for the organisation. And I was there in the 1980s and the 1990s when the BBC was creative, it was original, but it was also idiosyncratic, and it was quite shambolic at times. Those are one of the sort of things that endeared it to you. And I remember a lot of the newsroom, I went into the newsrooms as a very young journalist, and they seemed to run very much on tobacco and alcohol. And there was a legendary newsreader at the BBC that Andrew was mentioning to me just over dinner, a fellow called Peter Woods. I don't know if any of you remember him. He's sort of an old fellow with bags under his eyes. And he's dead now, so he can't sue me. But he was a regular in the bar at Television Centre, although he did usually manage to retain his self-control. His diction on screen was usually effortless. There was just one night on the 9 o'clock news, as it was then, not the 10 o'clock news, when he had to read a very complicated item about the widening trade gap. And you could see him squinting a bit at the auto cue and then gamely giving it a try. And now the trade figures. Imports this month were 8,450,000,000 and 500,000 pounds, and exports were, a very big figure. And the official explanation afterwards was that he'd been suffering from hay fever and he'd taken too many antihistamines. And I can remember starting at the BBC, I worked very briefly in the prestigious World Service newsroom at Bush House, which, as you probably know, is a 24-hour news channel. And inevitably, it involves people working long shifts, often overnight. And the consequences of wavering concentration and perhaps even inebriation were obvious in some of the news bulletins, such as when the Soviet space station, the orbiting space station Mir, was referred to as an orbiting police station for 3 consecutive hourly bulletins before anybody noticed. Finally, there was the radio newscaster in Northern Ireland, who shall remain nameless because he's a friend of mine. He came on air to read the midnight news after what had obviously been a very uplifting evening in the pub. And he started well enough with a poised and confident, "Good evening, here is the news at midnight." But that was as far as he could get. And there was a sort of prolonged silence and a bout of nose blowing and coughing and shuffling of papers. And finally, a very inspired, "There is no news tonight." Looking back at the BBC, I think I was there at one of its during one of its golden periods, and 15 years as a foreign correspondent certainly had its compensations. But then in 1997, after 4 years in Washington, D.C., covering the presidency of Bill Clinton, and then another posting back in Moscow in the mid-1990s, I left the BBC to go and work for the newly elected government in London, with Tony Blair as the Prime Minister. And at first it all seemed hunky-dory. In 1997 things started well for the Labour Party, and it started pretty well for me too. For a journalist who'd been observing politicians from the outside, as it were, the chance to go and work for the New Labour, the renowned New Labour information machine, was too good to be passed up. And I worked with Harriet Harman and Frank Field, then later with Alistair Darling, who were all admirable people. Alistair Darling in particular, I have to say, was a dedicated and selfless minister and full of integrity. He was the man who I think deserves much of the credit for saving the UK economy in the financial crisis of 2008. And then finally I went to work very briefly with Stephen Byers, who was none of those things. I was a civil servant, so I was bound by the civil service rules of impartiality, objectivity, and certainly no involvement with party propaganda and dirty tricks. That was the job of ministers and special advisors and spin doctors and people like Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell and Joe Moore. And on a serious note, that division between impartial civil servants and the party political operatives was eventually to become the source of a great deal of friction in the government. And I actually fell foul of it myself a bit later, 5 years later. But back in 1997, everything seemed rosy. And one of my first meetings with Alistair Campbell, who was the government's head of political communications, he did the Labour Party's communications, confirmed that impression. And I remember walking into his very imposing office in Downing Street, and he was sitting behind an equally imposing desk with his feet on the desk. He said, "Oh, hello, Martin." He said, just hang on a minute, I'm just polishing up my Coronation Street strategy. And I had no idea what he meant. And Coronation Street was a soap opera for those on television, for those of you who don't know it. And I had no idea what he was talking about until the next day when I opened the newspapers to find out that Tony Blair was intervening on behalf of a character from Coronation Street who'd been wrongly accused of a crime that she hadn't committed. She was a woman called Deirdre Rashid, née Barlow. Does anybody remember Deirdre Rashid or Deirdre Barlow? Anyway, but such was the wave of outrage among Coronation Street fans that Alistair had deftly spotted his chance. He could get in there quickly and he could show that his boss, Tony Blair, was a man of the people. He could show him to be in touch with popular opinion, even if it was more soap opera than political reality. And it was only later that it dawned on me that this was an early example of the inability to distinguish between fact and fiction, which later became a hallmark of the government. At the beginning, it was all jokey, knockabout stuff, and it summed up the atmosphere, really, of those early days. People liked the government. There were virtually no negative stories, and most of the media believed what the spin doctors told them. Ministers, too, seemed to believe blindly in the power of the spin doctors. And I remember every Labour MP carried a pager which was connected directly to Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson, and none of them was allowed to say or do anything until the line came through from Peter and Alistair. In fact, there was a joke about the MP who goes to the barber's to get his hair cut, and as the barber's cutting away, he notices a sort of hearing aid poking out of the MP's ear. So he takes it out and puts it down on the counter while he's trimming around his ear. But 2 minutes later, the MP falls down dead. And the barber's very worried about this. And he picks up the hearing aid and he hears the voice of Alistair Campbell coming out of it saying, "Breathe in, breathe out." I don't think that's a true story. In the early days, of course, spin was a good thing for the government, even when the odd hiccup happened, like the Bernie Ecclestone £1 million donation. Do you remember that? There was such public confidence in the integrity of the government that people were prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. So if the message from Number 10 was that there was no connection between the Ecclestone money and the government's exemption of Formula One from the ban on tobacco advertising, people in general tended to believe it. But it wasn't long before doubts began to surface about the credibility of the spin machine. And it seemed to me that the spin doctors actually killed the goose that laid the golden egg, because people began to think that their trust had been abused. After the cash for peerages scandal, the Lakshmi Mittal controversy, the row over Black Rod, and most damaging of all, the tragedy of the so-called Iraq dossier and the death of David Kelly, people simply didn't believe the government anymore. And I think it's that sort of legacy over the little things that undermined the trust in the government when it came to the big things, such as the invasion of Iraq. And it was that, incidentally, that caused me to fall out with Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell in 2002. That was what led me to leave my job as with the government and to begin a new career then as a writer and a filmmaker. It was a complicated row. It caused a lot of furore, but it was essentially about telling the truth. I thought it was quite important and they thought it was optional. But eventually the government realised that spin was not such a great thing, that it was quite damaging. But even when they announced that they decided to end their obsession with spin, people found that hard to believe. There was a lovely Private Eye cover, I don't know if you remember it, with a picture of Tony Blair with a bubble coming out of his mouth saying, "No more spin." And Alistair Campbell's behind him with a bubble coming out of his mouth saying, "That'll play well with the media." Or do you remember the delicious soundbite that Tony was told to give when the peace talks in Northern Ireland had made a breakthrough. He said, "This is no time for sound bites. I feel the hand of history on my shoulder." Well, you can't have it both ways. And spin, of course, is not confined to one party. The current government has had its own share of spin-related disasters. But the problem is, I think, that no government is going to give up on spin. However well-intentioned, they're not going to give up on it because it offers such advantages in shaping public opinion. But it also leaves the public constantly unsure if what we're being told is actually true. That's partly when I left Whitehall, that's partly why I went to work on The Thick of It, which was a political comedy, a political sitcom on BBC Two, directed by Armando Iannucci. And we use a lot of my experiences working in Whitehall as material for the plot lines. It doesn't take a genius to work out that the ranting, foul-mouthed spin doctor Malcolm Tucker, played by the brilliant Peter Capaldi, is actually based on Alistair Campbell. Or that the Darth Vader-like figure of Julius Nicholson, who's constantly on the prowl in the corridors, making sure that people are staying on message, is actually based on Peter Mandelson. It's jokey, of course. The Thick of It and the movie In the Loop, they poked fun, but there's a serious message in it somewhere. And I think they were alerting us to the fact that once you debase the currency of truth and integrity, then it's very hard to get that currency back. Overall, I suppose my conclusion has been that if you can't do anything to put the world right, you may as well have a laugh at it. And that brings me back to the era of Soviet political jokes, when people had even less trust in their government than we do in ours. That was really the sort of archetype of the post-truth era that we're now experiencing. But in the Soviet Union, it was a sort of Alice in Wonderland dystopia where you never knew what was true. And one of my own favorites is the joke about the two secret policemen, the two KGB men, who are sitting in the KGB canteen having a beer after work. And Ivan leans over to his pal and he says, "Tell me, Dmitri, what do you really think about this regime that we live under?" And Dmitri says, "The same as you do." And Ivan says, "In that case, it's my duty to arrest you." I did say that fact and fiction played a big part in my own career. Andrew asked me to finish by talking about the latest manifestation of that, namely the two books that I've written, Philomena, which was the photo behind me earlier on, and now just published this week, 4 days ago, a new book called Ayesha's Gift. They're both books that are based on a true story. It's a phrase that we see at the beginning of lots of films, the beginning of lots of books. And they're both about the relationship between parents and children. In the case of Philomena, it was an elderly Irish lady, played in the film, I have to say, very accurately by Dame Judi Dench, who's trying to discover what's happened to her baby son that she'd had out of wedlock in Ireland in the 1950s, and she'd been forced to give him away by a Catholic church that disapproved of women having babies out of marriage. And in Ayesha's Gift, the new book, it's about a young British Pakistani woman who's looking for the truth about her father, who's been murdered on a trip from his home in Burnley in Lancashire to Pakistan. And both books are based on fact. So in the case of Philomena, I met Philomena Lee after somebody tapped me on the shoulder at a New Year's Eve party and said that there was a great story that I should write about. And I was quite dubious, but I agreed to meet Philomena, and I found her completely lovely. She is, in real life, she's exactly as Dame Judi portrays her in the movie. So I spent the next 3 years helping her to find out what had happened to the little boy that was taken away from her and had been given to an American couple in St. Louis in Missouri in the Midwest in return for a very large donation to the Catholic Church. And I wrote that book in the style of what Truman Capote calls a factual novel. In other words, it had invented dialogue and invented situations. So that was one step away from documentary factual reporting. And then when Steve Coogan and Jeff Pope turned the book into a film, they took another step down that fact-fiction spectrum. They focused less on what had happened to the lost child and more on the relationship between Philomena and Martin. And I say Martin rather than me, because I didn't include myself in the book. And the character that Steve Coogan plays in the movie comes as much from him as it comes from me. And he portrays me as a bit of a self-satisfied, stuck-up idiot. But I didn't object because I knew that Martin would eventually redeem himself in the film by helping Philomena and learning from her that we need to be kind and forgiving in life. And there's something of that in my new book as well. I met Ayesha, of the title, her name is Ayesha Rahman. She was in her 30s, very bright, very attractive. She has an MBA. She runs her own, must be good, she runs her own consultancy business in the city, in London. And her parents were first immigrants from Karachi who'd settled in Burnley in Lancashire. And her father, Ibrahim, was a loving, caring father. And Ayesha grew up very fond of her father. He made sure that she got a good education. He looked after her interests. He didn't disfavor her in favor of the male children, which is quite prevalent in the Islamic community. So Ayesha did very well. But when I met her, she was in a terrible state. She was in emotional meltdown. She hadn't known that her father had gone to Pakistan. So when she got the news that he'd been murdered, that was completely a bolt out of the blue. But she was a very determined woman, and she was absolutely determined to discover what had happened to him. And she wanted me to help her find his killers and then write about it. She knew I'd done a similar thing with Philomena, and she wanted me to do the same with her. So we went to Pakistan together, and we were shocked by what we found there, not just me, but she, as a British Pakistani woman, she was shocked as well by the cruelty and the corruption and the violence. We met dangerous criminals, we met corrupt politicians, we were harangued and threatened by police who'd been bribed to stop us uncovering the truth. And we also heard stories about Ibrahim, her father, that were quite hard to reconcile with the picture of the loving father that Ayesha had painted. We heard stories of shady dealings and criminality. So it became a detective story with two goals. First of all, to find out who had murdered Ayesha's father and why, but also to discover who her father really was. Was he that good, kind parent that Ayesha remembered from her childhood, or was he a man who had a dark secret that he'd hidden from the world? And we argued about it, because Ayesha wanted me to portray her father as a saint. But I wanted to find out the truth, and I wanted to write it, whatever the truth would be. We argued, and as we were arguing, a second tragedy happened, and this time it happened to me, because the message reached us at our hotel in Karachi that someone very dear to me had died in England. I was shaken, and I dropped what I was doing, and I flew back home to England. And in the weeks that followed, I was beset by despair. But in those terrible weeks, something really remarkable happened, because instead of reproaching me for abandoning her and dropping her story, Ayesha extended the hand of sympathy. And she showed a compassion to me that I realized I hadn't shown to her. And it brought us together, because we were both driven now by the need to find the truth about someone we'd loved. And that shared understanding made us bury our differences. And we went back to Pakistan. And we discovered both the identity of Ibrahim Rahman's murderers, the murderers of Ayesha's father, and we discovered what sort of man Ibrahim had really been. So we answered the questions about Ayesha's father, and she helped me in return to come to terms with what had happened in my own life. And the moral of the book really is that we can't choose what life throws at us, but we can choose how we respond to it. And both Philomena and Ayesha have responded to the reverses in their lives with extraordinary fortitude. Both stories began ostensibly with me helping them, but with each of those two remarkable women, I was the one who benefited from having known them, and I'm very grateful for having done that. So in terms of fact and fiction, to come back finally to our theme, if you read Ayesha's Gift, you'll see that I've had to anonymize and partly fictionalize the story, and that's because some of the men who did the murder are still at large, and they're very dangerous people, and they threatened us with reprisals if we revealed their identities. But I hope you'll agree that on the scale of fact and fiction, moving that limited distance down the scale from fact to fiction doesn't negate the power of the story, and that it isn't comparable to what goes on in the world of politics today. And as evidence of that, I'd like to leave you with two final stories from the world of post-truth about the two men that we began with this evening and the double act that we'll all have to get used to over the next few years, Donald and Vladimir. And it is a fact, I can say it is a fact, that while Donald Trump won the electoral college that determines the presidency, he actually polled nearly 3 million votes fewer than Hillary Clinton. And that obviously rankled with Donald, because he's been rewriting history and tweeting that he won the popular vote. And when he was challenged, as a matter of factual accuracy, that that was incorrect, he tweeted that he was discounting all the illegal votes that had been cast for Hillary, and that his claim was therefore true. There was no evidence at all of any illegal voting, but in Trumpland the rule is that if the president says he believes something is true, then it is true. And that finally reminded me of a joke about our other friend, Vladimir Putin, and his approach to the results of elections. So when the polls close in Moscow, a Kremlin official rushes in to the president to say he has good news and bad news. "What's the good news?" says Putin. "You won the election." "And what's the bad news?" "No one voted for you." Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.